also talk about going from one chord to the next, even though some of that we ended up discussing. There are different types of motion. So when we're moving from one chord to the next, there are different types of motion that can happen with the voices. And I think I talked about this before the class, I sort of kind of learned over time that although it's nice to say don't do this, like don't do parallels and don't do, direct octaves or direct fifths or whatever. It's also good to say, but do this, this is the kind of voice leading, this is the kind of motion that works best. All right? So I want to go through some of that and talk about that, what works and what doesn't work. And in the book, let's see. That's nice. Hang on a second. Okay, yeah, so on page 81, they give these 5 different types of motion. And the first one they list is not really motion at all. They do this and call that static motion, which isn't really motion. But it's probably good to list it for completeness sake. But if you're on 2 notes and then you don't go anywhere to the next notes, then nothing's gone anywhere. So that's static, right? So static is not really motion. We don't need to worry about that. But the next one, they have the oblique motion. That's a good one. So oblique motion is when one voice stays the same and another voice moves either away from it or towards it. And usually that works out very well. Like oblique motion can work out very well when you're writing a chord progression. We talked about, you can hold a common note from one chord to the next, and that'll help you avoid parallelisms. So for example, if I was moving from a 1 chord to a 5 chord, here's my 1 chord. Then I know in the 5 chord I'm going to have another G. In fact, I'm going to have 2 of them, right? So it'd be a good idea to start thinking, well, I'm just going to hold that G in place. And then as my bass moves up to G there, I can do that, right? I'm writing root position 1 to root position 5. So that already takes care of some of my choices. I've already lost some choices. And then, again, it's kind of good to narrow these things down. So as I've held my common tone and moved my bass there, then everything else, I've got my 2 Gs. I just need a 3rd and a 5th. And I don't have any parallels. My octave is here. It moves to a 3rd. My 5th is here. It becomes an octave. So automatically, I avoid parallels by holding on to this common tone. In other words, by using oblique motion here. By holding this note the same and moving the other voices around it. So oblique can be very good motion for 4-part writing. Okay, then the other one the next one they've got is contrary. So contrary, obviously, when the 2 voices move in opposite directions, either both away from each other or both towards each other. So in this case, soprano moving up, alto moving down. Contrary motion also works out very well. And particularly, it works out well in the case of like moving from a root position 4 to a root position 5. So if I'm in C major, and I'm moving from a 4 to a 5 chord. Here's my root position 4, root position 5, it's really helpful because the two chords are right next to each other. If I do something like this, then I've just got parallels all over the place, right? The fifths are parallel, the octaves are parallel. But if instead I say, okay, I'm going to plan to move the bass up and everything contrary to the bass, against it. So if instead, well, I move the tenor down, I move the alto down, I move the soprano down against the uprising bass, then I don't have any parallels. My fifth moves to a third, my octave becomes a fifth, everything's cool. And that works for almost any situation where you're moving from, with your bass stepping up. It could be from like a 1 to a 2 chord. It could be from a first inversion, the chords in inversion. Anything, the situation where the bass is moving up, it's good to think about at least moving some of the other voices down against it. Okay, so that's contrary motion. Contrary motion is also good motion. So oblique motion is good motion. Contrary motion is good motion. Now the next one they have is the similar motion. And similar motion can get kind of tricky. But they call it similar because both voices are moving in the same direction, in this case down. Now they're not moving by the same interval, that would be parallel. Okay, so the next one, which is parallel, both the voices are a third apart, moving to another third apart. Okay, so that's parallel, when the two voices remain the same interval apart from each other. This is similar because the two voices move in the same direction, but this is a third and this is a fifth. Okay, so they're not parallel, they're not locked together, but they're similar. Now similar can work, but it can be tricky, and that's where the direct fifth and octave come in. Remember when we have similar motion to a fifth or an octave with a lead and a soprano, that's directs. And that's when similar motion can be kind of tricky. So you have to kind of watch out with similar motion. Be wary. Now with parallels are kind of tricky. Not so much because, oh my God, parallel octaves. But because some kind of parallels are good and some kind of parallels are bad. And actually, parallel thirds, like they have here, are fine. And you could do parallel thirds forever if you wanted to. It would get kind of boring after a while, but you could do it, you know. Or parallel sixths are fine. And they sound fine in terms of our Western harmony and theory. So if we just had a few parallel thirds, sounds great, you know? Parallel sixths. Sounds fine, you know? It's the parallel fifths that we don't like really so much. And parallel octaves is because it sounds really just like the same voice. So that's why we avoid those parallel octaves, because it really just becomes one voice, and we're trying to develop 4 independent voices in the case of avoiding parallels. Okay, so parallel thirds and sixths, which are really constant intervals on which all harmony is based, fine. Parallel fifths and octaves, not so good. And the same is true. Parallel fourths wouldn't sound good. It sounds kind of like Chinese music or something like that. The reason that that's avoided is because so early music, they were using just fifth and octaves to harmonize things. And so, you guys know what Gregorian chant is? You know, so they would take a chant tune and they would harmonize it by writing a voice like maybe a fifth above, and then they could also double it at the octave above. You know, like that was actually very common from the very beginning. You know, if you had boys and men singing together. The boys would sing up an octave and the men would sing down here. But then when they first started harmony, they started using the interval of a fifth. And so the kind of harmonizations they got were this kind of thing. Sorry. Sit down here. So they would. Oh no, that's a crutch. Let me try that. But they would do things like. That kind of harmonization. And again, that does sound kind of like old-fashioned or churchy. And so about the middle of the 14th century, that sound was perceived as being old-fashioned, and boring. And so the thirds and the sixths became the kind of harmony that we used, and the kind of harmony that we stuck with until today. So that's really why we avoid all this stuff. It's just seen as being old-fashioned. But I mean old in the terms of like 1,000 years old. Not, the way fashions change, like, oh, that's last year's fashion, Yeah.
Thirds and sixths, does that go for minor keys too?
Yeah, minor thirds, minor sixths, all fine, yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a little, sometimes like the minor sixth is considered more dissonant than a major sixth or things like that. But if you're talking about parallel sixths, it's all good. So in terms of motion that we like, oblique is good, contrary is good. Similar, tricky, and parallel, you just have to, with a grain of salt, you have to figure out what is parallel. Is it parallel fifths or parallel octaves? Bad. Is it parallel sixths? That's okay. But like I say, when you're working with four-part writing, it's actually best to look at like oblique and contrary, those kind of things. Those will get you a long way. Okay, so let's talk about your forbidden types of motion.